John McMullen from 97.3 ESPN.com is here. We've got Eagles news and notes galore as they get ready for this matchup with the Dallas Cowboys. NFC East. We'll do some NFL stuff with John, who covers the league nationally as well for today's pigskin.com, John. And we'll start off with what's happening here with this matchup. Obviously, this is a game that really could be a season setter for one of these two teams. I mean, if Dallas wins this game, they go to 6-1, and you got to start talking about them as the favorite in the NFC if they're not already. And if Philadelphia wins this game, it really makes things wide open. So this is a really interesting Sunday night football game.
Get into the football, though, guys. You were so negative on T.J. McConnell. That's a lockdown defender. Expect Westbrook to have, 10, 12 points. He's so good. But for the Cowboys, this is a big game. Obviously, it's early in the season. It's not going to cripple either team to lose it, but I think both look at it as an opportunity to send a message to another team in the division. And obviously, Dallas playing at home. It's been an interesting rivalry recently because the Eagles have kind of had success down there and struggled at home. And, the Cowboys want to hold serve, and you have the rookie quarterback versus rookie quarterback angle. You have the great offensive line against the Eagles' tremendous front. So there's a lot of interesting matchups, and to me, it comes down to the Eagles' offense. Can they produce at a higher level than they have been over the past couple of weeks? Because they're going to need to. It's a different type setup than we saw against Minnesota, which was a bad offensive team, great defensive team. Now you have a great offensive team thanks to that running game, and a defense that's average, maybe above average at times. So the Eagles are going to have to go about their business in a different way.
Yeah, John, this is a team that you look at the points allowed. Dallas has only given up 107. That's not really indicative of their defense, though, because a lot of that is based on the way they control the clock. Philly was controlling the clock in their early games. Time of possession was a bad word around here for a couple of years, but it has really been a key for why Dallas has been so successful because their defense isn't great.
No, it isn't talent-wise. I think the secondary is a little bit more talented than people think. But the front seven, especially early in the season with all the suspensions and things of that nature, it's not really – you look at it and say you're concerned with it, and I think that continues. So Dallas has to – yeah, you're right. I mean – that running game not only helps the quarterback, we always talk about it being the best friend of any quarterback, but it's also the best friend of the defense because you do tend to win the time of possession. You keep them off the field, and that obviously makes things a lot easier for that side of the football. So everything in Dallas is fueled by that offensive line and that running back, and so far they've been really, really good.
Yep, and Elliott, 707 yards. He leads the NFL. I mean, he's having a historic pace right now. Prescott, two rookies. You don't see this a whole heck of a lot, John. That, I guess, we talked a little bit about this on Tuesday when you were in. I guess a little bit of that shows how dominating that defensive line has been. But one guy who wasn't – Benny Logan missed last week. But this might be a week where it is noticeable that he might there. He had a pretty good couple games recently against this Cowboys offense. In fact, he was vocal about it and said, they're not as good as everybody makes them out to be.
Yeah, I mean, Benny's a really good player, and I don't think he's going to play this week. And I said it dating back to last week. I mentioned I didn't think his absence was going to mean that much against the Vikings without Adrian Pederson because they just don't have the running game to take advantage of it. This week is a whole different ball game. And as I said, I don't think he's going to be able to be out there. And we'll see how Bo Allen can hold up. That's the reason they brought Taylor Hart back instead of getting a cornerback to replace the injured Ron Brooks. They need more bodies inside. And it's not necessarily the best place you want to be against the Dallas Cowboys, especially on the interior when you think about Travis Frederick playing center, Zach Martin, who I think is the best offensive lineman in all of football, no matter the position. It's going to be a much more difficult week for the Eagles front.
John, how about Jaylen Watkins? Because this guy has an interesting story. At one point, he was drafted and then cut from the team, and now he's with Ron Brooks going down. He's going to play a major role on Sunday night.
Yeah, he is. They're going to go back to sort of what they did last season in the nickel when they would put Malcolm Jenkins in the slot and then insert a safety. Last year it was Chris Maragos. This year it's going to be Jaylen Watkins. And that's what they did against Minnesota when Brooks got injured. That's how it's going to continue. Again, this is not the best week for that. At times, Malcolm Jenkins can dominate in the slot. He proved it last year. But he struggles against really small, quick receivers. And you might have the best slot receiver in football right now on Dallas, and Cole Beasley, who's he drives you nuts with those option routes. And nothing is called for Cole Beasley as far as running a route. He basically looks at the leverage of the defensive back, and he has an option off of that. And the quarterback and the receiver have to be on the same page. So maybe you can hope that the rookie would occasionally not make the right read. But that hasn't proven to be the case in Dallas thus far. And I can tell you that Cole Beasley's going to be open more often than not.
Sunday Night Football with all the attention that takes place at Jerry World, too. One thing that hasn't been a part of our narrative this week as we both recap the Vikings game and talk about the Dallas game, penalties were not an issue in the Vikings game. That did not come up. And yet now they go back on the road, crowd noise, those issues. Do you think the penalty bug springs its ugly head again?
It could. And that's what I said before the Vikings game. I said you probably don't have to worry about it this week because you are at home, and those things tend to calm down when that happens. So there's a number of issues you have to worry about when you go back on the road. One of them is the penalties. Another is obviously the play of Vaitai at right tackle, because we've talked about that. It's much more difficult for young offensive linemen when you're dealing with silent counts and noise. And you have sort of that split second where you can't get off the ball. It makes it a much more difficult environment. So all of that happened, that went wrong in Washington, is back in play now that they're on the road again. But, while you say that, okay, if it's 8 penalties, even 9 penalties in today's environment, maybe you can live with that, but you can't have those numbers up at 13 and 14 where the Eagles were against the Redskins and the Detroit Lions.
John McMullen, 97.3 ESPN.com. John, I want to get your opinion on today's press conference. Doug Pederson denying that the Eagles have had any conversation. He's thrilled with his wide receivers. He's got Huff. He's got Aguilar, who both can stretch the field. So are you buying what the Eagles head coach is selling?
Of course not. I mean, that's what he has to do as the head coach. I mean, hey, the reality is it's difficult. If you look at the 2 names that have been bandied about, Torrey Smith in San Francisco, Alshon Jeffrey in Chicago, they both have big contracts. So even if you have another side that's willing to deal, and you probably do, and even if you can agree on compensation, which you probably can, then you have to deal with the contract issues. And that's the most difficult hurdle because in the case of Smith, he's got 3 more years at significant money. Jeffrey's under the franchise tag, which means you can't renegotiate until the off season. So that's a concern. And it's, if you're putting a percentage on it because of those reasons, it's more likely than not nothing's going to be done. And all of a sudden, if November 2nd rolls around and you have your receivers and your coach hasn't defended them, all of a sudden you could lose them mentally. So I think Doug took the prudent path, and it was all praise. And, hey, I like my guys, but we all know the Eagles have been trying to improve this position again and again and again, and they'll continue because they know they need help at this position.
John, the one spot, yes, they need help at that wide receiver position, and the one spot where they are okay is Matthews. I mean, in the slot there, he's a guy that, the problem is you can't really game plan a game around your slot receiver. What do teams do to kind of take him out of the game? Because you would think if he's the slot guy, are these teams just one-on-one matching up with these guys? I mean, do they just have no respect and just manning up and just beating them in man-to-man coverage?
Pretty much.
Jeez.
I mean, that's what Minnesota did, and they pretty much, if you go back in that game, especially early, Harrison Smith and Andrew Sendejo, before he got hurt, the two safeties, they're basically within 5 yards of the line of scrimmage. That tells you all you need to know.
Yeah.
That means they had no respect for the receivers. And but while I say that, that's a tremendous secondary, a tremendous defense. You don't have that every week. The Cowboys certainly don't have that kind of defense. So when you do have that, if it's Seattle or Richard Sherman and Earl Thomas are out there, yeah, you're gonna get that lack of respect until you beat them. And the reality is, the skill set of the Eagles receivers, you're just not going to beat players of that caliber. And that's what's going on right now, and it's an issue.
Yeah, because, you just mentioned it there. The teams aren't respecting the Eagles on the outside. It's like, where can you take – if they're manning you up on the outside like that, that's why the middle of the field – and that trickles down to the tight ends maybe. You only had 3 catches last week or 8 catches in the last 3 games. That's where the trickle-down comes in. Why aren't the tight ends more involved? How come Jordan Matthews isn't more productive? Well, they're manning you up on the outside, which is clutter in the middle of the field.
Yeah, that's part of it. And I think that another part is Lane Johnson being out, obviously, since that happened. The pass protection hasn't been nearly as good. Even last week, I mean, you look at it on paper and say, well, the Eagles didn't give up any sacks, and that's good. There's no question about that, especially when you looked at it going into the game. But Minnesota rarely blitzed. It was pretty clear Carson Wentz was not comfortable. So it's not always about the number of sacks. It's just getting the quarterback out of a comfort zone, getting him off his spot where he wants to throw the football. You saw the one where Carson was going against his body and had the bad throw. All of that, I mean, that doesn't register as a sack, but you created a huge mistake as a defense. And so I think it's kind of a perfect storm in that you have outside receivers who can't get open in single coverage. You have pass protection that's not necessarily there. And even when it is there, by the way, the quarterback thinks it isn't going to be there. So that affects him mentally, and he's hurrying. So I think it's all of those things sort of coming together, and that's why the passing game hasn't been all that effective.
John McMullen with us, talking a little Eagles football. And I know one of the buzzwords that was used over and over, both in his day after press conference and I think today, was target line. Are you getting quarterback lessons from Doug Pederson on how to become a better quarterback?
Well, if you do want quarterback lessons, NovaCare Complex is a good place to be because you got so many of them. And it starts with Doug and Frank Reich and John DiFilippo. And even Chase Daniel is sort of a coach in the locker room type. So there's a lot of really, really smart people who know how to play that position, sort of mentoring Carson Wentz. And I think, as I've said from early this season, I think that's one of the underreported aspects of him doing so well early in his career, what the Eagles have sort of set up. I think Teron Davenport, I'll give him the credit, called it the quarterback incubator. It's a really good environment for him, and there's a lot of guys who understand how to play that position.
Well, I know another buzzword has been game manager, and sometimes that has a negative connotation, sometimes that has a positive connotation. Do you consider Carson Wentz to be a game manager in the positive way?
No, I don't, to be honest. I don't think it's very, very difficult for a young quarterback to be a game manager in a positive sense because they do make too many mistakes. And even when they're playing well, you go back to the Detroit game and everybody criticized Carson for taking the deep shot. A game manager would have taken the safe thing and played for the next down. So he's still got that gunslinger mentality. He wants to push the football down the field. And by the way, that's not a criticism. I'd rather have that than the opposite of the guy who's always trying to play it safe, always taking the easy way out, always checking it down. I think that's not what you want. That's not what you expect from the number 2 overall pick in the draft, and that's not what the Eagles have. They got a really talented guy that can make a lot of plays, not only with his arm but with his feet. You saw it again with that little play to Darren Sproles after the missed snap, and he was able to extend it. And so he does a lot of good things, even when he didn't play that well against Minnesota. But yeah, game manager is not the first adjective sort of I'd use to describe Carson Wentz.
John McMullen, 97.3 ESPN.com. Of course, you can read his national football coverage over at todayspigskin.com. And as John talks about on the website as well, today, Doug Pederson dismissing trade rumors. I guess we'll have to wait till Tuesday to find out that. But a lot of times where there's smoke, there's fire. There's a lot of conversation going on. It's not a surprise to hear Howie Roseman bring something up here, but we'll have to keep our eyes on that. We'll do that throughout the course of the week. Last night it was funny, John. It almost felt like it was the trade deadline because you're on Twitter. I typed Alshon Jeffrey's name. I had a listener tweet at me, "Hey, I hear Jeffrey got traded to the Eagles. Can you confirm?" And I'm thinking to myself, what is going on here? So people are kind of on edge right now, wanting to get something done. But we'll keep that up, and we'll also, of course, have John back.
I guarantee Howie's taking phone calls at the bare minimum.
Are there a couple of guys on this roster that are tradable? Are there a couple of guys right now who are like, man, this might be my last game here on Sunday?
Well, I don't think any, because as I said, the NFL trade deadline is not like the baseball trade deadline or the NBA trade deadline, where there is sometimes significant movement. It's still rare. You've already seen a couple of lower-profile trades. Patriots usually are one of those teams. So there's always a possibility. I'm sure there's certain guys. Michael Kendricks would be one who doesn't seem to be a great fit for what Jim Schwartz is doing. And he's got such a great physical skill set. He could still have some value. So there's a few, but again, I don't think in the NFL anybody anywhere expects to be traded because it's just not really part of the culture like other sports. But as we've seen with Howie Roseman, he's a little bit different. And if you look at all the GMs, Tim McManus said it on the show yesterday, over the years he's been twice as likely to make trades as the next closest GM.
That's crazy.
So if anyone's going to do it, it's going to be Howie.
All right, John's back tomorrow as the coordinators will speak. We'll hear with Jim Schwartz. First time he's talks since his team had a nice turnaround, so we'll hear from him. Frank Reich, John will have he is the mouthpiece for those guys tomorrow on the Sports Bash 97.3 ESPN. Take care, John.
Hey, thank you, guys.